The Boston Bruins, one of the original six, one of the most consistent franchises in the National Hockey League, a team well known worldwide with their North American and European talents running the show. Whether you had dreams or nightmares because of them, love them or hate them, you've got to admit that their decision making to become a franchise that has made 15 playoff appearances out of 17 years is impressive. In this video, we are going to go through how the sometimes risky decision making of multiple Bruins front offices led them not only to one Stanley Cup victory, but two more very close Stanley Cup finals, and how everything comes full circle to the present day. We will go chronologically through every season, the important moves in and out of the team, and how they impacted the team in the present or future. After a few years of repetitive first-round exits, the Boston Bruins became one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference in 2005-06, a full 18 points out of the playoff picture. Joe Thornton, one of their top scorers and their first overall pick in 1997, was very unhappy with the club and requested a move out of Boston, which was granted partway into the season in November, with Marco Sturm, Wayne Primo, and Brad Stewart as the return to Massachusetts. Jeff Gorton came in as the interim general manager for the remainder of the season once Mike O'Connell was fired, and soon head coach Mike Sullivan was out of a job too. The Bruins ended up hiring Peter Chiarelli as their general manager and Dave Lewis as their new head coach, out to test whether this team could become competitive again in a few years, not as a team that could bounce out again in the first round, but instead go to the second round and further. Chiarelli knew that everything the Bruins needed to do was in the years ahead, and he kept with that concept. In free agency, the Bruins acquired a tall defenseman from Slovakia by the name of Zdeno Chara, someone they knew quite a bit about since he had registered 43 points in 71 games with the Ottawa Senators the previous year, and apart from the lockout season he spent in Sweden, was in that point range when he was playing in the NHL. They knew that he would bring a mix of attack and defense, not just a playmaker, but someone that can dish a solid hit along the boards when necessary. Impressively, they also acquired experienced forward Mark Savard, who at 29 was coming off an incredible season with the Atlanta Thrashers as a ninth top scorer in the league at 97 points in 82 games, what would ultimately be his best season in his career points-wise. Coincidentally, Thornton's name would be above his, finishing top of the league in scoring with San Jose. But it was a trade that year, before Chiarelli even came in, and Gorton was still in the office, that would change the team's fortunes for a very long time. And it was for a little-known goaltending prospect from Savonlinna. The 2005 NHL entry draft had two goaltenders selected in the first round. The first was Carey Price, selected 5th overall by the Montreal Canadiens, someone that Canadian hockey fans knew quite a lot about, given that he was in the Western Hockey League and had the potential to be Canada's top goaltender for another decade and a half, a hybrid in an era where hybrid goaltenders truly had the potential to succeed. The other first-round goaltender was Tuukka Rask, selected 21st overall by the Toronto Maple Leafs, and apart from scouts, very few knew about this butterfly goaltender from Finland who had played only 37 games in Liga up to that point. As it turns out, Rask did not even know about Toronto or Boston too much, as he recalled in an interview with Spit and Chicklets podcast last year, recounting being at a party in Finland when he found out his NHL rights were moved. Rask would end up changing the face of a franchise when he arrived in North America, but it would not be Toronto or even Ottawa, who also heavily thought about putting his name on their jersey. The Leafs front office believed that Justin Pogge, one of their prospects who recorded a 1.72 goals against average and 926 save percentage in the same WHL that Price was in and a World Junior Championship gold medalist for Canada that year, would be their long-term option. They needed a second-string goaltender that could be just as valuable down the road and had some experience in the NHL. The Leafs did not want to trade Pogge for any possible offers because those results looked so impressive. So ultimately, the Bruins agreed and traded their Calder Trophy winner in 2004, Andrew Raycroft, for Rask, while at the same time promoting Tim Thomas to the starter role. There was a sense that the Bruins front office was not interested in keeping Raycroft anyway, because sources in that front office later stated to the media that Raycroft would have been released if there was not a team open to a new goaltending acquisition. This was not the only trade with Toronto that backfired on the Leafs and gave the Bruins an opportunity to become one of the top teams in the league, but we will get to the other one that involved their future first-round selection a little later. After a draft that saw Phil Kessel selected 5th overall, Milan Lucic in the second round, and Brad Marchand in the third, the Bruins had a season that was just as poor in 2006-07, and after after 1 year, the office realized that Dave Lewis' strategy was not going to work, so he was out of a job. And he would continue to move from place to place in the decade afterward between being an assistant coach in the NHL and a head coach of national teams, those being Ukraine and Belarus. Peter Chiarelli hired Claude Julien, a coach who had a fantastic season with the New Jersey Devils, near historic actually, but was surprisingly fired right before the playoffs by Lou Lamoriello because Lamoriello had other intentions with regards to how the team was going to be run strategy-wise for the playoffs and promoted himself to the coaching role. The following year, the Bruins would finally make the playoffs again, just squeaking in as the 8th out of 8 by just 1 win. 2 points above the Carolina Hurricanes. The moves that were made proved to be vital to the team's success. Sturm would end up being the team's top scorer, Savard would be the points leader at 78, second-year captain Chara had the best plus-minus, but also spent quite a bit of time in the box with his tough play along the boards, his timing of hits being something he improved over time, and Thomas was relatively solid in goal. They would play the Canadiens with Price in goal and the best team in the conference at the time in the first round, and despite a respectable effort in the first 6 games of the series, it all fell apart in the 7th as they would be knocked out with a 5-0 thumping. That result hurt for sure, but the team was improving not just gradually but significantly, and it was not entirely their fault that they ended up the 8th seed as injuries happened to be quite common. Peter Chiarelli would make quite a few moves in free agency just after a draft that, from Boston's perspective, ended up being relatively uneventful. Probably the most notable move in free agency was bringing a player from Montreal in Michael Ryder, who had 30-goal seasons between 2005 and 2007. Apart from that, Patrice Bergeron was coming back after being knocked out during a game against Philadelphia early in the prior season, and by this time Phil Kessel would solidify his status as a full-time forward after missing out on some of the prior year due to a battle with cancer, which fortunately he won. The Bruins had committed players that wanted to step up. The potential to succeed was there, and very soon, success became their reality. Tim Thomas would fully take advantage of the starting role, breaking records from time to time, and very soon Tuukka Rask would introduce himself with a shutout of the New York Rangers for his first career NHL win. Mark Recchi would join the team in one of the last trades of the season's window, ending a relatively brief tenure with the Tampa Bay Lightning in a trade that saw Matt Lashoff and Martin Karsums go to the Florida side. Combined, Lashoff and Karsums would end up playing 46 NHL games for the rest of their careers. The regular season ended in 53 wins, and they went from a team that was at the bottom of the Eastern Conference playoff standings to a team at the top. Their first-round opponent would coincidentally be the same Montreal team they faced last time, and Michael Ryder would be the one to shut down his former team, using what he learned from his time with the Habs against them, and scoring 4 of the Bruins' 17 goals en route to a very quick sweep. They would play the Carolina Hurricanes, coached by Paul Maurice, in the second round and almost booked their place in the Final Four, but Scott Walker silenced TD Garden with the overtime winning goal near the end of the first overtime period from a rebound off a Ray Whitney initial shot in Game 7. Just before the start of the 2009-10 season, the other massive trade between Boston and Toronto happened. Phil Kessel did not want to continue with the team, and so he moved on to the Maple Leafs in a deal that sent 3 picks to TD Garden: the 2010 first-round pick, the 2010 second-round pick, and the 2011 first-round pick. The Leafs had a bad season in 2008-09, finishing just 12 points out of the playoff picture, but nobody in their front office really expected their situation to become so dire that they would finish last in the conference, and the pick they gave up in this deal would end up becoming the number 2 overall pick. That pick would end up becoming Tyler Seguin, who recorded a single point for Boston in their 2013 series with the Leafs. The other 2 picks would be Jared Knight, who would never make it to Boston and ended up retiring before the 2017-18 season, and 2011 9th overall pick Dougie Hamilton, who would play 3 seasons with the Bruins before eventually moving to Calgary as a free agent. Two-way forward Daniel Paillet would join the Bruins in a trade from the Buffalo Sabres, bringing more of an advantage for Boston on special teams and as a decent hitter, while at the same time goaltender Manny Fernandez would leave the team and unofficially retire in the months afterward, thus officially making Rask the backup. There were a few other veterans that left the team. The younger players now had a chance to promote to the main squad and bring more speed to the Bruins game, both on attack and defense. Rask would become the starter for a while, with a fantastic period between the middle of December and the end of the year. However, after Thomas and Rask started splitting duties, duties between starter and backup again, January became a month to forget. The Bruins finished 3-9-2 in that month, and February saw them fail to win a game at home but go unbeaten on the road. By the time the season ended, the Bruins were well below expectations, 6th in the conference and with a 39-30-13 record. They were able to win their first round series with the Buffalo Sabres in 6 games, but this was followed by the series every single Bruins fan that got to see those days would like to forget. The 3-0 series lead against the Philadelphia Flyers, blown with 3 of the 4 defeats coming by a single goal, and with Sam Gagner scoring 2 game winners, including the series winner of the 4 goals he scored in that span. After acquiring Paille, the Bruins made another move by acquiring Nathan Horton and Gregory Campbell from the Florida Panthers, with the return to Sunrise being Dennis Wideman. In Horton, the Bruins were getting a player that had a hard shot and knew how to weave his way to the front of the net, while in Campbell, the Bruins knew they were getting a tough guy, someone who would sometimes rack up penalty minutes and get involved in fights, but someone who at other times would also dish a decent hit along the boards and bring more defensive stability. The Bruins would end up conceding 195 goals in 2010-11 in a season where 4 teams in the Eastern Conference alone conceded 200 goals or less. To put that into perspective, when compared to the modern day, only 4 teams have conceded 200 or less in an 82-game regular season since 2019. And the Bruins finished 3rd among those 15 teams with a .561 record, 46-25-11. Boston had a team that was ready for the playoffs, a career-defining moment for most of them. Montreal was their first-round opponent again, and despite falling behind in the series, losing the first 2 at home, they were able to win Game 3 in regulation and 4 in overtime to bring the series back to Boston level at 2 apiece. Game 5 went into the second overtime, ended by Nathan Horton on an easy rebound at the front of the goal from an Andrew Ferentz attempt on the left side, and after losing Game 6 by a single Brian Gionta goal, it would be Horton again in overtime that rescued Boston and sent them into a rematch with the same Flyers team they suffered heartbreak against the previous year. They had no problem in that series. David Krejci scored 3 game-winning goals, and the Bruins would dominate Philadelphia by 4-goal scorelines in 3 of the 4 matchups, 7-3, 3-2, 5-1, 5-1. Believe it or not, Tim Thomas had a better series than that. The Bruins would knock out the Tampa Bay Lightning, the same team that was near the bottom of the NHL 3 years earlier before drafting Steven Stamkos, in the Eastern Conference Final. And would you believe it, in 5 years, they went from a team languishing at the bottom of the NHL after multiple disappointing results to a team in the Stanley Cup final. Again, they fell behind in that series, losing both games in Vancouver by 1-goal scores, the second on a wraparound winner by Alexandra Burrows just 11 seconds into the extra frame, but it is like something instantly changed between the 4th and 6th of June. Game 3 was not even close. The Bruins started blasting hard shots at Roberto Luongo and were there for practically every rebound too, eventually learning that the best way to get something by Luongo was to get him out of position. The first goal was a point shot from Andrew Ferentz, but the second, third, and fourth, all within that same 20-minute span, had Luongo out of his goal on all of them, and were scored 3 different ways. The second by a tap-in by Mark Recchi in front of the goal, the third a genius move by Brad Marchand to deke Luongo out, the fourth a rebound from David Krejci in the center off an initial shot by Michael Ryder. The Bruins ran rampant in that frame, and added 4 more in the third for what would ultimately be an 8-1 victory, with a boatload of penalties handed out like it was Christmas. Canucks defenseman Aaron Rome was suspended for the rest of the finals for his hit on Nathan Horton earlier in the game, a hit with such an impact that Horton missed the rest of the finals too, and tensions boiled over in the third, but most of the Bruins players would return to Game 4 and dominate the Canucks again with a 4-0 result that also included a boatload of penalties. In a span of 120 minutes, Tim Thomas was playing the best hockey of his career, facing 79 shots and stopping all but one of them. Despite outshooting Vancouver at Rogers Arena, the Bruins would lose Game 5 by a single goal from Maxime Lapierre early in the third period, but a 4-goal first period in Game 6 would prove to be the difference back at TD Garden, and they would ride that out for a 5-2 victory to force the decider. The Bruins had to play overly defensive in Game 7, facing 37 shots compared to 21, but just like Games 3 and 4, the defense was excellent and Tim Thomas was back to stellar endurance performances. Patrice Bergeron opened the scoring by whacking the puck through the legs of both Henrik Sedin and Christian Ehrhoff off a pass from Brad Marchand. They doubled the lead with a wraparound from Marchand himself off a Dennis Seidenberg shot, and Seidenberg would get yet another assist in that same period by setting up a Bergeron breakaway just seconds after a face-off in the Boston zone. Marchand would send the puck into the open net within the final 3 minutes of the game, and that was it. The Boston Bruins were Stanley Cup champions. For the franchise, a 39-year wait was finally over. Every single decision that led to that moment finally paid off, but the Bruins' success was not going to end there. They had achieved what they wanted, but the team was still not done. Quite a few players left the team after that historic moment, and Mark Recchi retired after his third Stanley Cup triumph, the other two having come with Pittsburgh and Carolina. The season looked absolutely dismal at first, with 7 losses from 10, 3 of which came from teams they eliminated in the playoffs the prior year. The Bruins had an excellent November and December, though, going 21-3-1 in those 2 months, and ultimately finished the year second in the conference and 7 games above 500 with 102 points and a plus 67 goal difference. Tyler Seguin solidified his status as a top forward for the Bruins, leading the team in scoring at 67 points, one of 4 60-plus point players on the team, but the team as a full unit lacked consistency in the first round, and it ultimately ended in a Game 7 overtime defeat to the Washington Capitals. During the lockout prior to the shortened 2012-13 season, the Bruins acquired Jaromir Jagr in a trade, and then during the year promoted Rask to a full-time role after Thomas was traded to the New York Islanders, eventually playing 48 games with Florida and Dallas before retiring. They lost a few players to free agency, but extended Marchand and Lucic to multi-year contracts and gave that same Seguin a 6-year deal, while also giving Tuukka Rask a 1-year contract for him to prove his worth as a possible starter. After a 48-game regular season, finishing 4th in the conference, they took on the Toronto Maple Leafs in the first round and almost blew a 3-1 series lead, before completing an ultimate comeback from 3 goals down in Game 7 with 10 minutes and 42 seconds remaining. That was followed by an 8-1 record against the New York Rangers and Pittsburgh Penguins, with Rask conceding only 2 goals in the latter series, setting up what would be an eventful Stanley Cup final series with the Chicago Blackhawks, the same team that won the championship a year before Boston did, defeating Philadelphia in 2010. They were able to take a 2-1 series lead, but the following 3 games were all extremely close defeats to Chicago. The deciding one, in which the Bruins conceded 2 goals in a 17-second span after being just over a minute away from forcing Game 7. Even with all of the good moves the Bruins made, no team or general manager is perfect, and so there was one really bad move looking back. Riley Smith arrived to the Bruins just under a month after the Stanley Cup final defeat, involved in a trade that had Joseph Morrow, Matt Fraser, Louis Eriksson, and himself go to Boston, while Tyler Seguin, Rich Peverley, and Ryan Budden were sent to the Dallas Stars. I just mentioned how much of a contributing figure Seguin was, and the fact that he had been inked to a 6-year deal. So why would the Bruins want to trade him? Automatically, those on social media jumped to conclusions that Seguin was another case of a promising young talent that loved to party so much that his commitment to the team dropped, and this may have affected his performances, which ultimately led to this decision, but Chiarelli ended all of the questioning by stating that he would fit in more as a center than a winger, which is what he was positioned in when representing Boston, and that Dallas would be able to manage that better than Boston would. While Seguin would succeed with Dallas, registering 70-plus points up until the 2018-19 season, Chiarelli's return was not too great. Eriksson would play only 3 seasons with Boston before moving to Vancouver, since his point production was not what it was when he was in Texas. Morrow did not spend a full season at the NHL level, and Fraser played only 38 games before going on a plane to Edmonton. With the divisional realignment and new playoff format, Boston was now put into the Atlantic Division, and won it, with April the only month they went below 500. November and March were especially notable, with the Bruins going 10-3-2 and 15-1-1 in those spans. Their first round series would be against the Detroit Red Wings, winning 4 consecutive games after losing the first on a single Pavel Datsyuk goal. The second round would be against Montreal, and despite jumping into a 3-2 series lead, the Bruins would collapse in Game 6 and then drop Game 7 by a 2-goal scoreline. The 2014-15 and 2015-16 seasons were both ones to forget for the Boston Bruins. The only 2 times they missed the playoffs, and both times by 5 points or less to Pennsylvania-based teams. In 2014-15 it was by 2 points to Pittsburgh, and in 2015-16 it was by 3 points to Philadelphia. The Bruins did, however, make some smart choices in the 3 NHL drafts between 2014 and 2016. In 2014 they selected David Pastrnak, soon to become one of the biggest draft steals, 26th overall out of Czechia, immediately promoting him to the NHL despite no experience on North American ice sheet, and they followed it up by selecting Danton Heinen 90 picks later. 2015 saw them draft Jake DeBrusk in the first round, and Brandon Carlo in the second, and then 2016 saw them draft Charlie McAvoy and Trent Friedrich in the first round. Prior to 2016-17, David Backes was acquired in free agency after he spent a full decade with the St. Louis Blues, and the Bruins promoted Sean Chiarelli, who was acquired from San Jose in a trade for Martin Jones years earlier. But the general manager that made most of these moves was gone by then. Chiarelli was fired and went to the Edmonton Oilers less than a month later, his replacement to be Don Sweeney. In 2016-17, the head coach was to leave too, marking the end of one era and the start of another. Julien's time as Bruins coach was over, and he returned to Montreal just days after being fired. The reason for Julien's departure was that the Bruins were not the most consistent at the time and needed a new face to guide them to the playoffs with a new strategy. Bruce Cassidy was his replacement, someone who had experience at the NHL level as a head coach with Washington and an assistant coach with Chicago in the early to mid-2000s. Cassidy was able to help them make the playoffs, finishing level on points with Toronto, but winning the head-to-head tiebreaker to claim third in the Atlantic. The Bruins ran into a decent Ottawa Senators team in the first round, who knocked them out in 6 games. Coincidentally, that was followed by another great draft selection for the Bruins in 2017, 4th-round pick Jeremy Swayman, a goaltender of the USHL, who committed to the University of Maine in the NCAA for the following year. After making his debut in the Ottawa series, Charlie McAvoy was officially promoted to the main squad and got his first full season in the NHL in 2017-18. During the season, Don Sweeney completed an original 6 trade with the New York Rangers that sent veteran forward Rick Nash to Boston, while Ryan Spooner, Matt Bolesky, 2016 second-round pick Ryan Lindgren, and 2 draft picks would be the return to NYC. One of those draft picks ended up being traded to Ottawa for another one 4 picks up, with the Rangers eventually selecting Keandre Miller. Nash was another case of a player that arrived around the time of the trade deadline and almost immediately made an impact, recording 6 points in 11 games, and then added 5 points in 12 playoff appearances as the Bruins knocked out Toronto in 7 before dropping their second-round encounter with Tampa Bay in 5. The Bruins were unable to keep the other Nash, Riley Nash, who went to the Columbus Blue Jackets in free agency, but they signed free agent defenseman John Moore to a 5-year contract, a move that was not too surprising at the time, considering that Moore played well as a pass supplier / solid hitter along the boards. It could be viewed as a bad contract on the surface, looking at it from a present-day perspective, but it actually helped the Bruins succeed down the road, the reasons of which I will mention later. The Bruins also signed Yaroslav Halak in free agency as a backup to Rask, agreeing to a 2-year contract worth $2.75 million per year for the then 33-year-old. Joakim Nordstrom was also acquired in free agency, and Marcus Johansson would join the team during the season in a trade that sent 2 picks to New Jersey. Nikita Okotiuk and Ethan Edwards were those selections, Okotiuk having recently played with Calgary and Edwards still in the NCAA with the University of Michigan but unsigned. Second round pick of 2014, Ryan Donato was also sent elsewhere at the deadline, to the Minnesota Wild, where he would have an excellent start with his new team, in exchange for two-way forward Charlie Coyle, who saw a change of scenery after 7 years in the Twin Cities. Coyle would not make an instant impact, and it would also take Johansson some time to adjust to the new environment, but as soon as the playoffs began following February and March campaigns that were both well above average, they stepped into their new roles just in time for Toronto. The Bruins were keeping pace with the Maple Leafs, losing games 1, 3, and 5, but winning games 2, 4, and 6 to be able to send the series back to TD Garden for yet another fateful Game 7. Tuukka Rask, the goalie Toronto could have had this whole time, was phenomenal in those 60 minutes, stopping 32 of the 33 shots he faced. Nordstrom and Johansson opened the scoring in the first period, the latter off a giveaway from Jake Gardiner on what was supposed to be a routine Leafs line change, and Chiarelli and Coyle would also get on the score sheet before Patrice Bergeron himself would secure the Bruins' place in round 2. It was these acquisitions that the Bruins made, especially over those 12 months, that ultimately decided the series for them, proved Don Sweeney to be a genius yet again, and sent them hurtling into a series with the Columbus Blue Jackets, who, at the time, swept what was then the greatest team in NHL history. Then is a key word here. The Bruins fell behind in that series, but managed to get past Sergei Bobrovsky in the following 3 games and booked their ticket to the Eastern Conference Final against the Carolina Hurricanes, a team they would eventually sweep. Among the main contributors to that playoff success, apart from the usual figures of Marchand, Bergeron, etc., David Pastrnak, who is now in his second year of dominant playoff hockey, Charlie Coyle, who registered 16 points, and Marcus Johansson, who had 11. For the third time in 9 years, the Boston Bruins were going to the Stanley Cup final, and for the second time, they were playing a team founded between 1967 and 1970 that had not won a Stanley Cup in their history, the St. Louis Blues. This series had shades of 2011 to it. The Bruins were very close at times and dominant in others. They split the first 2 games, the second being an overtime defeat on a Carl Gunnarsson shot from the point just 4 minutes into the extra frame. The third game was not even close, with the Bruins setting up from the point, noticing how much open space the Blues were giving them from that section. 7-2 was the final score in that away game, as Jordan Binnington's night was over just over halfway through. The Bruins could not keep that momentum into Game 4, however, dropping that one by a 2-goal result, and they lost Game 5 by a very close result too. Just like with the Vancouver series, they stormed back with a 4-goal victory, taking Game 6 by a 5-1 score, but were relatively silent when it really mattered, as by the time that Matt Grzelcyk sent the puck past Jordan Binnington and over the line at the 17:50 mark of the third period in Game 7, St. Louis had blasted 4 by Tuukka Rask, and they were champions on the North American hockey circuit. Apart from John Beecher being drafted 30th overall in the 2019 NHL entry draft, someone that would make his debut 5 years later and the only draft pick from that year eventually promoted to the NHL level, the offseason was relatively uneventful for the Boston Bruins. That was also a good thing, though, as the squad remained the same, continued to develop consistency, and won the President's Trophy as the best team in the National Hockey League the following year. But they played 70 games because COVID-19 hit. Nobody was really sure whether the season would continue, but eventually the NHL gave the go-ahead for a 2014 bubble tournament in Toronto and Edmonton involving the teams that also could have made it, but would not have been given a chance if they were not in the top 8 in their conference by the time the season was postponed. So instead of playing the Columbus Blue Jackets, who they would have played if the season ended with a regular 16-team bracket, they would have to go to a round robin against Philadelphia, Tampa Bay, and Washington instead, losing all 3 of those games. Because of the pandemic, some players requested to opt out of the playoffs, and their wishes were granted. In Tuukka Rask's case, he exited halfway through the first round series with Carolina, since his daughter was undergoing a medical situation, and most importantly, life always comes first before hockey. With Yaroslav Halak in goal, the Bruins knocked the Hurricanes out of the bubble in 5 games, before being knocked out by the eventual Stanley Cup champions Tampa Bay Lightning in 5 games. The 2020 NHL entry entry draft was held remotely and saw Mason Lohrei, a promising defensive prospect of the future, selected in the second round with a 46th overall pick. Free agency saw the Bruins lose multiple experienced players, with Joakim Nordstrom off to Calgary, Torrey Krug to St. Louis, and veterans Zdeno Chara's contract not renewed, eventually leading to him signing with the Washington Capitals. The only notable signing in free agency was Craig Smith, arriving from Nashville after 9 seasons there, reaching over half a point per game in his debut season with his new team. The season would be modified again, with the Bruins put into the East Division alongside other teams in the region due to COVID-19 travel restrictions. Partway through the season, fans were allowed at limited capacity, and by the time the month of May was over, TD Garden was allowed to have all seats full in the venue. March was a disappointment, but just after an 8-1 defeat to Washington, the only really poor loss from the team in the month of April, where they finished 11-5-1, they made a key move in acquiring Taylor Hall and Curtis Lazar from the Buffalo Sabres in exchange for Anders Bjork and a second-round pick in 2021. That pick would be Alexander Kisakov, who is now in Rochester. Hall made an impact almost instantly, recording almost a point per game with 14 and 16 games. In 17 games, Lazar recorded 4 points. Boston finished third in the division behind only Washington and Pittsburgh, and faced Chara and the Capitals in the first round, with the first 3 games going to overtime, but Boston taking 2 of them. The double overtime decider in the third matchup came from Smith, who pulled off a wraparound behind the net after a mishap from Ilya Samsonov and sent it over the line into the bottom right corner. A 4-1 win at home and 3-1 away meant that the Capitals' season was over, and the Bruins would play the New York Islanders in round 2. Those 2 teams split the first 4 games of the series, and surprisingly, Cassidy gave Jeremy Swayman his first playoff appearance, with Rask having been starter in all of the prior games. The second period was when it fell apart for Boston, conceding 3 goals in that 20-minute span and ultimately losing 5-4 after pulling the score back to 1. 2 days later, the season would come to an end in Uniondale as another second-period masterclass from the Islanders proved to be the difference. In free agency, Erik Haula became another rival to TD Garden from Nashville, joining the Bruins on a 1-year contract. However, the era of Rask as the main goaltender for the Bruins was coming to its end, with the Finnish netminder unable to continue full-time during the 2021-22 season due to a series of injuries. He would ultimately retire at the end of the year, but a succession plan was in place. Jeremy Swayman was promoted to a full-time goaltending position, and Linus Ullmark was signed to a 4-year, $20 million contract by the Bruins, with some questioning the value of the contract for a goaltender that had average results, backstopping a Sabres team that was far from their best, finishing well out of the playoff picture. Because Ullmark's only games of experience on the North American circuit were with Buffalo, not too many fans knew that he could perform well with a great team around him. Ullmark and Swayman split the year, both achieving a goals against average under 2.5 and a save percentage between .910 and .920. Their stats were almost equal in those regards, but Ullmark was better in terms of record, finishing 26-10-2, while Swayman went 23-14-3. The other 4 games were credited to Rask, 2-2-0. Marchand was the team's top scorer again, the 6th time he reached that achievement in his career, but Pastrnak also recorded over a point per game. Haula ended up 6th in scoring with 44 points in 78 games. The team was able to reach 51 wins, 9 above 500, and clinched a playoff spot with 7 games still to spare. But the division was very competitive. Tampa Bay finished 3 points above them for the 3rd direct spot, so the Bruins became the first wildcard seed. The home team won every single game in the series between Boston and Carolina. The Hurricanes won the first 2 games in Raleigh with Ullmark and net, but the Bruins were able to tie the series at 2 when it went back to TD Garden with Swayman in goal. Swayman would be in net for the rest of the series, but the Bruins would ultimately lose Game 7 at PNC Arena by a 3-2 final score, with Max Domi scoring the series-winning goal, with the assist from Teuvo Teravainen and Jacob Slavin, both of whom registered their second points of that afternoon. At the end of the year, Bruce Cassidy's time as Bruins coach was over, and he was hired by the Vegas Golden Knights, a team who weeks earlier missed the playoffs for the first time in their history, and removed their second coach in 5 years in Peter DeBoer as a result. The Bruins hired Jim Montgomery as their new head coach. Montgomery's prior experience leading behind the bench of an NHL team was when he was the head coach of the Dallas Stars in the 2018-19 season before being fired due to an off-ice issue. Montgomery kept with Cassidy's defensive tactic of bringing two players to defend against one in close proximity, a move that can be considered high risk at times but remained highly effective even after years of use. The 2021 and 2022 NHL drafts were decent for the Bruins, as they would select Swedish playmaker Fabian Lysell with the 11th overall pick in the one, and then the other they picked two promising talents in Matthew Poitras and Dans Lochmelis, the latter of which made a significant impact at the 2022 IIHF World Junior Championship for his country Latvia 2 months later. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that John Moore would be key to the Bruins' future success, and it was at this point. Before the 2021-2022 season ended, Moore would be traded to the Anaheim Ducks in a 2-for-1 with Urho Vakanainen. The player that would be going back to Massachusetts would be experienced Swedish defenseman Hampus Lindholm, who by this time had 9 seasons with Anaheim under his belt, along with a World Championship gold medal for his country. Lindholm would bring more defensive stability to the Bruins in that he is excellent when poking the puck away, particularly from the neutral zone, and his successful long-range pass completion was vital to what the Bruins needed for dump and chase scenarios. That was something that became crucial to the Bruins' success 2 years later, but it will be mentioned later in this video. In July, another smart move was made, bringing in David Pasternak's Czech national team teammate Pavel Zaha in a trade with the New Jersey Devils that sent Erik Haula to Newark. Zaha needed a change of scenery after the 2015 6th overall pick had failed to register a 50-point season with the Devils. Don Sweeney's push to acquire him and Lindholm within the span of a few months proved to be significantly beneficial on Boston's side, as Zaha finished 4th in scoring that following season, and Lindholm finished 6th, first among defensemen. Both Swayman and Ullmark would have phenomenal seasons as the number 1 and 2 options for the Bruins, with the latter even scoring a goal on the empty net against Vancouver. The team itself broke the 2018-19 Tampa Bay Lightning's record as the best team in NHL history, finishing the year without a single month they finished below 500 in. And in the months of October, November, and April, those were especially significant as they won 8-1-0, 11-2-0, and 7-0-0 in 29 games. The Bruins were set to make a historic Stanley Cup run. There was not a single doubt in anyone's mind that they would, but their first-round opponent turned out to be Sergei Bobrovsky, the same goaltender that stunned the Lightning 4 years earlier, and the Florida Panthers, who were President's Trophy winners the prior year but had some playoff struggles themselves. Boston would pull away with a 3-1 series lead, winning the 2 games in Sunrise to put the Panthers on the brink of elimination, but Paul Maurice defeated Boston in the past with other elite squads, and he was willing to do it again. Game 5 saw the exact same mistake that Samsonov made 2 years earlier, but this time it was against the Bruins. Linus Ullmark kept the puck behind the net in order for Matt Grzelcyk to reach it, but it slipped away from him, went right to Carter Verhaeghe, and in a split second, Ullmark now had to make a desperation save as Matthew Tkachuk grabbed the rebound, moved the puck to his backhand, and shoveled it into the net to take the series back to the Sunshine State. The Panthers won a high-scoring Game 6, forcing a decider at TD Garden. Boston fell 2-0 behind in the first 27 minutes of that Sunday evening matchup, but rallied back with David Krejci, Tyler Bertuzzi, and David Pastrnak scoring. Tyler Bertuzzi and Dmitry Orlov, who joined the team from Detroit and Washington at the trade deadline, were assist contributors, but with Bobrovsky pulled for the extra attacker, Florida was able to get their goal back and force overtime with exactly 1 minute remaining in regulation. Carter Verhaeghe got the assist on a Brandon Montour shot to the bottom left corner, squeaking between the blocker and pad of Jeremy Swayman. Verhaeghe would then score the series decider from the high slot on the right side of the ice with a wrist shot off a feed from Sam Bennett behind the net. Florida won this series and the next 2 to make the Stanley Cup final before ultimately losing to Bruce Cassidy's Vegas Golden Knights. Just like Tampa Bay, the best campaign in the history of the NHL ended in a painful result. In Tampa's case, it was a sweep. In Boston's, a blown 3-1 series lead. but the only way the Bruins could go is forward to improve on what they already had and to go even further. Patrice Bergeron's storied career came to an end as he announced retirement, and David Krejci was gone as well. Connor Clifton signed with the Buffalo Sabres, Tyler Bertuzzi was off to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and Dmitry Orlov went to the Carolina Hurricanes, where he has since become one of their top defensive players. Brad Marchand, who has slightly cleaned up his game after being quite a figure among the hockey fan base in the past with his antics, became the new captain of the Bruins since Bergeron was now gone from the team. Nick Foligno, who played 2 years with the Bruins prior, left the Chicago Blackhawks along with Taylor Hall in a trade that sent 2 AHL players in Alec Regula and Ian Mitchell to Massachusetts. Mason Lohrei was promoted to the main team for the 2023-24 season, along with Matthew Poitras and John Beecher. There were quite a few players who joined the team as well. Morgan Geekie was probably the most notable player to join the Bruins in free agency, signing a 2-year contract from Seattle worth $2 million per year. James Van Riemsdyk, who ended his return to the Philadelphia Flyers and suffered quite a few years of heartbreak to Boston with prior Toronto squads, became a member of the team on a 1-year contract. Jesper Volkvist joined the Bruins on another 1-year contract, having played the prior 2 seasons with the New Jersey Devils. Danton Heinen, who was a member of the Bruins before 2020, returned to Boston from Pittsburgh on a 1-year deal. Kevin Shattenkirk also signed a 1-year contract after 3 years in Anaheim. Right before the trade deadline, the Bruins acquired veteran enforcer Pat Maroon from the Minnesota Wild for AHL prospect Luke Toporowski and a 2026 6th-round pick. This would mean that the Bruins would have more of a defensive mix on the fourth line, someone to counter players like Ryan Reeves or Sam Bennett in terms of physicality, depending on the first-round opponent the Bruins would face, and Maroon's presence would especially come in handy if the Bruins made a deep run for the Cup that year. The season started with an impressive 8-0-1 record in October. November, December, and especially February were below expectations, but the Bruins still kept pace thanks to a much better January, and by the time that late March arrived, they were battling the Florida Panthers for the top spot in the Atlantic Division, and despite defeating the Panthers twice, Florida edged out the Bruins on the very last day by a single point following their 5-2 win over Toronto and Boston's 3-1 loss to Ottawa. David Pastrnak would finish well ahead of Marchand as the season's top scorer, posting 110 points compared to Marchand's 67, with Coyle and Zaha not too far behind Marchand. Of the new signings, Morgan Geekie finished 7th in scoring with 39 points. Van Riemsdyk, Heinen, Lindholm, and Shattenkirk were coincidentally below each other down the list, all finishing with over 20 points after 60-plus games. Swayman started 43 games, playing the full 60 minutes in all of them, and only had to be brought in for Ullmark once. Ullmark played 40 games in total for the Bruins squad. Their goals against average and save percentage totals were almost identical, but Swayman was better in both categories. Toronto was, for the 4th time in 12 years, their first-round opponent, and oddly enough, this series would be another where the Bruins grabbed the 3-1 series lead, dominating Game 1, but involved in very close battles when the series went back to Scotiabank Arena. Toronto would be able to pull back in this series and force a Game 7 by taking the following game in Boston 2-1 in overtime, and winning the return fixture 2-1 in regulation. The first and second periods of the decider were scoreless, but William Nylander got Toronto into the lead, his 3rd goal in 2 games, but Boston responded quickly. Just a minute and 21 seconds later, after a few close whacks in front of the net, a Van Riemsdyk pass from behind the net straight to Hampus Lindholm on the left side ultimately led to the Swedish defenseman sending a shot through a couple of screens into the top center to level the score. I mentioned earlier in the video on the Lindholm trade how he would be crucial to the Bruins' playoff success down the road, and this is what I meant. But he was not done. That dump and chase strategy I mentioned earlier is something he has had in his wide range of abilities for a long time, and he picked the perfect time in this series to do so. He gets the puck from David Pastrnak under 2 minutes into overtime, skates left of center, looks at Pastrnak weaving his way around Mitch Marner on the right side, and blasts the puck in Pasternak's direction. It banks off the boards at the exact moment that Pastrnak cuts to the inside, Morgan Rielly trailing behind him, meeting him as he gets to the front of the net. All it took for Pastrnak was to move the puck from forehand to the backhand, putting Samsonov into a desperate position and sending the puck above the helpless Leafs netminder. Checkmate. That was it. Game and series. The Bruins were off to face Paul Maurice in Florida yet again, a team that had 5 more days of rest before Game 1 than the Bruins did, because they knocked Tampa out by 4-1. That one Panthers win at the end of the regular season gave them home ice advantage. Boston opened the series with a 5-1 blowout win, and it seemed to be going their way, but the following 6-1 and 6-2 wins by the Panthers flipped the series the Cats' way. In the latter matchup, Florida jumped into a 3-0 lead in just 17 minutes and went 4 for 6 on the man advantage, while the Bruins managed only 17 shots in total. The Panthers won the following match by 1 goal, a 3-2 result, pushing the Bruins to the brink of elimination, and so now the question was this. The Bruins blew a 3-1 series lead the prior year. Did they learn from their mistakes, and can they turn this one around? They did manage to win Game 5 2-1, but lost by the same score when the series returned to Boston as Gustav Forsling sent the Panthers to round 3 with a light flick of the rebound off an Anton Lundell initial shot. Florida, as you know, went on to win the Stanley Cup, so in 3 years they won the President's Trophy, made the final, and then won it. 2 of those years partly coming at the Bruins' expense. And that is where we are now, the present day, the 2024-25 season, just around the corner. The Bruins lost a few players in free agency, most notably Jake DeBrusk signing a long-term deal with the Vancouver Canucks, Danton Heinen joining him in Vancouver, Jesper Boqvist going to Florida, and Matt Grzelcyk off to Pittsburgh. James Van Riemsdyk and Kevin Shattenkirk both became free agents but have not been signed by any team yet. And at the time that I am making this video, Jeremy Swayman's contract still has not been extended. The Bruins invested more heavily into European talent, signing Elias Lindholm and Nikita Zadorov from free agency. Both of those players spent some time between Vancouver and Calgary in 2023-24 and were involved in 2 separate trades. The goaltending situation changed too. Unfortunately, with Ullmark having had no appearances against Florida and Jeremy Swayman having been figured out by the Panthers in that 2024 second-round series, the lasting bond between these two was going to end on the ice as the Bruins knew they needed a fresh goaltending face as starter or backup moving forward. Swayman was about to become a free agent, and Ullmark had 1 year left on his contract, but with Swayman as a slightly better goaltender statistically over those seasons, Ullmark would be traded to the Ottawa Senators in exchange for Joonas Korpisalo, Mark Kastelik, and Boston's first-round pick in the 2024 NHL entry draft that they traded in the past to Detroit for Tyler Bertuzzi, and Detroit traded to Ottawa for Alex DeBrincat. With that pick, 25th overall, the Bruins surprised hockey fans by picking Dean Letourneau straight out of St. Andrews College, before he even started playing at a more elite level. Letourneau is now committing to Boston College, meaning that since he is in close proximity to the Bruins' offices, approximately 10 miles away, the team can be involved in further evaluations and development. Some Bruins fans question the trade, considering that Korpisalo struggled with Ottawa in the prior season, but 1, they were not looking at the full picture of the trade, and 2, as mentioned earlier, it was the exact same case with Ullmark and Buffalo when the Bruins traded for him, and looking back, that was one of the best moves they could have made. It also comes full circle to 2005 and the trade this video started with, since Korpisalo uses a similar mode of the Finnish goaltending style to Tuukka Rask, coming from the exact same Finnish team that Tuukka Rask was developed with, Tampere and Ilves. He moves very quickly and effectively like Rask does, and his ability to stop initial shots are decent, but he needs to work on his rebounds, something that Rask also had a tough time with in his time on the Bruins. Korpisalo is also an endurance goaltender, a reliable option if a game goes past 60 minutes, and it was not more evident than his 85-save performance against Tampa Bay in 5 overtime periods in Game 1 of his 2020 playoff series with Columbus. Korpisalo is using the exact same Finnish goaltending strategy that Rask used, and as his time with Los Angeles showed prior to signing with the Senators, he is decent if he has a decent team surrounding him. It works for the Bruins as well, as there is now balance, as instead of 2 basically hybrid goaltenders, they now have Swayman, who has hybrid qualities, but not necessarily one specific full-time style as he mentioned himself, if they sign him, and they have Korpisalo, who is a butterfly goaltender. Ullmark is a definite hybrid, so now if they take on a team like Florida, the Panthers will now have to face two completely different styles of goaltending, and it's not going to be that one set strategy defines every game of the series. The Bruins knew that Pat Maroon would probably leave the team by the end of the year, and so they acquired Kastelik to be able to develop, someone that plays very similar to Maroon in that he can be a playmaker at times, but is better with pushing opponents around. That was the correct move, as Maroon signed with the Chicago Blackhawks on a one-year deal, worth a total of $1.3 million. Kastelik is expected to get promoted to the Bruins early into the 2024-25 season, a chance for him to prove himself. There are many factors that were involved in this decision, but when you look at this deal thoroughly, and not just on the surface, you can see why Don Sweeney made this move, and not only does it bring everything full circle in that the Bruins traded for a Finnish-style butterfly goaltender that could become important to their future on the ice, or traded for other missing pieces of serious value, it's another example of a high-risk move that brings the team more overall stability, changes a few things both in the present and future, but can push them back into cup contention, and that is the theme of this video, these whole 18 years we looked at. You look at the Bruins squad in the present day, and you see that these are players that the Bruins drafted and consistently developed well, or acquired in trades when they were at relatively lower value, and then brought them to their full potential with what they had already built. That said, who knows if this one works too? We never know until the season happens, but given the history the Bruins have had with these sorts of decisions, I would not be surprised if it does. The Bruins made Pastrnak, Marchand, Bergeron, Krejci, DeBrusk, Swayman stars after they were drafted in 2000 onward, with Dean Letourneau, Fabian Lysell, Dan Zlochmelis, Matthew Poitras, John Beecher, Mason Lohrei, and so on. The Bruins have just as good of a future as their present, both on the attack and on the defense. And then you have the players like Kastelik, like Geekie, like Zaha that they acquired and were able to turn to players that can develop in full. And they look to do the same with their new signings. It was interesting to see how many times the Bruins believed in players and gave them chances when those players may not have been able to get another. If the Bruins front office in 2006 did not trade for Tuukka Rask, who knows what would have happened to his possibility to play in the NHL. The Leafs wanted Justin Pogge. He would be their goaltender of the future. Rask may not have had any time in Toronto, but at the end of the day, the Bruins believed in him, traded for him, gave him the opportunity, and he excelled, even being key to the Bruins teams that knocked Toronto out 3 times. If they did not trade for Rask to start all of this, who knows how differently everything would have gone. That trade was what signified the beginning of a dream for Boston, and despite currently being just 1 Stanley Cup championship and 3 finals, with many players having come and gone, it led them to consistency that very few teams in the NHL have, and that will probably lead to even more consistency, maybe even a 2nd Stanley Cup title in the future. This was one of my favorite videos to make because when I was going through the history of this team over the last 2 decades and every decision that led to the present day, I was able to not just appreciate what it took for the Bruins to build themselves as a cup contending team that is feared every single year and how they did it, but really how any team is built, even the Vegas Golden Knights, who immediately used what was available and not just build a team that fit within the salary cap from the expansion draft, but a team that made multiple conference finals and won a Stanley Cup in just 7 years. Regardless of what league you are in, NHL or another league in the world, ice hockey or not, it takes a lot to achieve that sort of consistency, something that takes a master plan over a long time and with so much more behind the scenes than I can break down in this one video alone. I'm not a Bruins fan myself, LGRW, but I must give credit to them for the intense work they have done in their scouting, drafting, trading, development, and everything in between because it has all paid off. In 2 decades, they have earned their place to be among the top of the sport and created a fantastic future for themselves, something that very few teams will ever be able to replicate. That is it for this video. With the hockey seasons in North America and Europe getting underway very soon, I will be posting more hockey content on the NHL, Liga, and international tournaments with statistics on the NHL and scouting reports for the 2025 draft being at the forefront, along with recaps of Finnish national team games during the IIHF World Junior Championship over the holidays. The videos will be released less often though, as the second year of my post-secondary program is also taking place, and most of my time will be devoted to that. Making videos here or posting to the blog is something that I will be doing in my spare time, so it really depends on the intensity of the material I have to complete within my program. I will be giving you updates as soon as they come on any future videos though. If you like this video, give it a like or subscribe to the channel for more hockey content like this. If you have any points about the Bruins that I did not cover here, as I am sure there are many other things about this team and its 2 decades of dominance that I did not speak about here, please feel free to comment down below and I will respond as soon as possible. Again, thanks for watching, and I will see you again in the next video real soon.